have an exciting new small grant initiative called the DDH-TTA AAC initiative. What does that mean, you might wonder? Well, it stands for the Disaster Distress Helpline, Training and Technical Assistance Affected Area Center Initiative. This is a new small grant initiative launched by MHA NYC under our roles as administrators of the Lifeline and Disaster Distress Helpline networks for SAMHSA to support crisis contact centers that are located in and serving areas impacted by major disasters. A crisis contact center in the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline Network would need this grant because crisis centers play crucial roles throughout all phases of disasters, including needing to maintain essential operations when disasters strike, so that there are minimal disruptions to the life-saving services that clients and consumers rely on 24/7. Crisis centers, through their hotlines and other services, they provide emotional support to disaster survivors and responders in their areas. And these are people who are experiencing temporary distress reactions and may just need the listening ear that crisis counselors provide in order to help them move forward on the path of recovery. And also, just like crisis centers do year-round or during blue skies, like we like to say in the disaster preparedness world, crisis centers are also uniquely equipped to support people with pre-existing mental health conditions, but which may have been triggered or aggravated by a disaster event, like depression, anxiety, or substance abuse disorders. And those conditions also might have developed after the event for people touched by the disaster who were exposed to trauma or who are otherwise having a difficult recovery from the event due to social isolation related to the disaster, like disruption in transportation, which may be short or long term. They're cut off from their usual social supports. They might have economic distress related to the disaster. And so all of these factors contribute to a person's either temporary distress reactions or those more serious mental health concerns that might develop. And crisis centers, they do all of this, not just year round, but also in the immediate aftermath of disasters and during the long-term recovery. Well, the eligibility criteria for a crisis contact center under the Lifeline network that they need to meet in order to apply for this grant. First, they have to have been a Lifeline network crisis center for at least 6 months. They have to be located in or serving as the primary crisis contact center for an area, which can be defined as a city, a county, a multi-county region, or even the entire state. But this area has experienced a major disaster within the past 12 months. What does that mean, you might wonder? Basically, we're defining a major disaster as any natural or human-caused disaster. It could be earthquakes, hurricanes, wildfires, major floods, tornadoes, or other severe storms, to incidents of mass violence like terrorism or mass shootings. It could also be transportation disasters. It could be public health crises, or even incidents of community unrest. So a pretty wide range of a major disaster that might have occurred in the community or communities that the crisis center is serving. The past 12 months is essentially just to establish a time frame because the grants are meant to support any long-term recovery, which happens for months or even years following disaster events. But also it's meant to support crisis centers that were just impacted by disasters and that could really use this grant to help support their operations in the immediate aftermath of the disaster as well. So it's within that time frame and within that criteria of what a disaster is. And so an important part of the eligibility criteria for applying crisis centers is also that they do have to demonstrate need for emotional support services. And usually the size and scope of the disaster matches that. And so the bigger the disaster event that might have involved fatalities, mass injuries, massive amounts of property damage or destruction, those are usually strong indicators that there has been a significant level of psychological impact in the impacted areas. So an applying crisis center, They can use criteria that the disaster has met for meeting a major federal disaster declaration. It could also have been a state disaster declaration. Sometimes incidents of mass violence or things like public health crises might have other criteria that they've met to receive a sort of declaration from the state or federal government. So the crisis center should look into that. So what kinds of criteria has the disaster met in order to receive aid in the community? But they can also just write about in their application what they're seeing in their crisis center in the immediate aftermath of the long-term recovery. What types of contacts have they already received from their community in terms of the psychological impact? So they can also include qualitative elements to their application. So those are really the three main criteria: at least 6 months as a Lifeline Network center, that they are located in or serving an area that's experienced a major disaster at any point from immediately to the past 12 months, or from the date of the application, by the way, for the 12 months criteria. And that they in their application, they need to demonstrate a strong and compelling need for emotional support services. So what is the grant support? Well, currently we have 3 grants available of $12,500 each. And these small grants are meant to support 3 key functions: training your staff in psychological first aid, which is an evidence-informed best practice that is used in the field of disaster behavioral health. Psychological first aid is primarily a field-based tool that's used for things like shelters and recovery support operations by any range of workers, from social workers to trained volunteers. But we're training crisis centers in psychological first aid because that's often what crisis centers are doing in the aftermath of disaster over the phone, or their other crisis contact services like text or chat. They're providing psychological first aid to people impacted by disasters. So we're offering the grants to support training in psychological first aid, as well as training in our own curriculum that we've developed at MHA-NYC to support the Disaster Distress Helpline, which we call Just-in-Time Disaster Crisis Counseling for Crisis Contact Centers, which is a 4-module curriculum that takes about 3 hours. It's online. And so that we're also supporting crisis centers getting trained in our method, which takes the principles of PFA, but applies it to a crisis call or text setting. So that's the first thing it supports, is training. The second is that the grants are also supporting staff time and effort to engage with and participate in their local or regional disaster preparedness, response, and recovery community with outreach and communications. And that includes connecting with their long-term recovery community of providers that are specific to the disaster in question. Because crisis centers need to get involved in their communities with boots on the ground. Often we think of crisis centers as places where people come to us, but when it comes to disaster, you have to go to the scene, which means basically just attending meetings, attending conference events that are sponsored by local voluntary organizations active in disaster, or VOADs. Some communities might have what's called COADs, community organizations active in disaster. And this is what crisis centers are. They are VOADs and COADs. And so we want crisis centers to dedicate staff to go out into their community, attend these meetings, participate in these coordination calls, and really just meet the community as well of people that have been impacted by the disaster. So these grants will support crisis centers in actually designating staff to go out and do these things. And communications, because social media is a really important part of disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. So we want crisis centers to also dedicate time and effort for staff to develop social media related to the disaster, to promote their services in relation to the disaster. We want them to create creative communications around the disaster, like videos and things like we're doing right now. So this grant can also support those communications operations. Finally, the third part of the grant is supporting crisis center continuity of operations planning. And the reason why we're tacking on continuity of operations planning as a part of this grant is because when a crisis center has experienced a major disaster, it's an opportunity to learn. to learn what worked in maintaining their continuity of operations during the disaster event, as well as what didn't work and what they need to improve upon. And so we want crisis centers to use this small grant to dedicate staff, time, and effort to strengthening their COOPs, or maybe even developing a COOP from scratch if they don't have one already. And that takes time and effort and staff time. So we want this grant to be able to support those efforts as well. So those are the three things that the small grant supports: training in disaster behavioral health curricula, staff time and effort for outreach and communications related to the disaster event, and continuity of operations planning. So MHA NYC with Lifeline and the Disaster Distress Helpline, where this is a pilot program, and so we're doing a bit of experimenting. So a few things. One is the entire application process is online. So we're actually, for the first time, having the small grant opportunity be an online submission process, soup to nuts. And so what crisis centers need to do that are interested, they can also go to this web link that I'm about to give to just learn more about the grant as well, and everything we just talked about. It's through SurveyMonkey, so crisis centers can go to www.surveymonkey.com/r/2017 DDHAAC. So again, that's surveymonkey.com/r/2017 DDHAAC. There, you'll not only be able to read more about the opportunity, but you'll also be able to download a PDF of the application, because we recommend that crisis centers actually write their responses offline in MS and Microsoft Word, and then copy and paste your answers into the online submission form. That way you just have a backup. Crisis centers can, but it all is all online, so you copy and paste, or you can just write out your answers straight into the SurveyMonkey platform. It's a simple narrative that you have to complete based on the criteria that I mentioned. You have to describe the disaster. You have to talk about the role that your crisis center can or has played in the disaster event, etc. We want you to submit a budget describing how you'll use the grant, and some other just standard procedures for submitting an application. We've really worked to make it a fairly simple process, not overly complicated, partly because we recognize that particularly for those crisis centers that have just experienced major disasters, we want them to be able to do this quickly. Once crisis centers have submitted their online application, we'll send you a receipt, a confirmation that we've received the application, and then within 10 business days, we'll notify you as to the status of your application. And so crisis centers that are applying, you can also start and stop the application online, and the materials on the SurveyMonkey site tell you how to do that, in case you can't do it all in one sitting. We are, again, just really working to make this a simple process as possible, and just excited that, like you said, excited that a lot of crisis centers, we're hoping, recognize that this small grant can go a long way in helping to support their efforts in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery, both year-round, during blue skies, and in the aftermath of a major disaster that's impacted their area. Disasters are inevitable. I would venture to say that of all the crisis centers that are in the Lifeline network, over 160, probably all 160 of them have been located in a community that's been impacted by a disaster, or are serving a community impacted by a disaster, whether that's a major flood or a wildfire or an incident of mass violence. And so through this initiative, we really want crisis centers, we want to support their efforts in this disaster in question, but we also want to encourage and motivate crisis centers to get ready for the next disaster that impacts their area, because this is what we do as crisis centers. We serve people in need who are experiencing mental health concerns related to any type of trauma or issue like disasters. And so we think that this grant initiative will go a long way in accomplishing that. And if folks have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at cburgess at mhaofnyc.org. That's CBURGESS at mhaofnyc.org. Or you can give me a ring at area code 212-614-6346. And I'm happy to answer any other questions people may have about the DDH AAC TTA initiative.